Okay, let's start. Welcome everyone to this first capacity building event of the YEPA, the Youth Entrepreneurship Policy Academy. We had the pleasure to meet in person in March with a successful launch event. And as promised, as discussed during the kickoff of this group C, today we are meeting in order to discuss access to finance for young entrepreneurs. On Monday, we had Group A, and there was a specific focus on microcredit. Yesterday, there was a specific focus on GovTech and spin-off from universities. And today, a specific focus on crowdfunding. But we will have a more general discussion as well. You will see on the website of the YEPA, you will be able to watch the sessions of the other groups if you're interested in. So it's not lost. And now it's my pleasure to directly give the floor to a director of the European Commission in DG Employment, Ruth Passermans, who is director for funds programming and implementation, and who is supervising the unit I'm working in. So the unit dealing with inclusive entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We, after the successful event in March of the Youth Entrepreneurship Policy Academy, today we have the first genuine capacity building event of the Academy. Youth unemployment remains high in several places of the EU, and we must act. Helping to the creation of self-employed business activities is part of the solution. And our ambition with this academy is to trigger policy changes in favor of youth, thanks to a better mutual understanding between policymakers, experts, and representatives. Today's session is dedicated to access to finance for young entrepreneurs. This is indeed one of the most serious obstacles identified, if not the only one. According to a Eurobarometer survey we conducted recently, about 4 out of 10 respondents said that an important reason stopping young people from becoming entrepreneurs is not having enough capital or resources to be self-employed. Most entrepreneurs finance their startup with the funding from the 3 Fs, the founder, their friends, and their family. But beside these, other solutions exist and will be discussed. Today, after a general presentation of the tools available, the focus is going to be on crowdfunding. And indeed, crowdfunding and more generally, fintech innovations are to be explored. According to our research carried out together with the OECD, crowdfunding can indeed increase the supply of finance for entrepreneurs. Successful crowdfunding campaigns can also help entrepreneurs from underrepresented and disadvantaged groups, such as youth, to build legitimacy and visibility for their projects. The regulatory environment must, however, be carefully designed. In EU, the regulation 2020-1503 on European crowdfunding service providers for business lays down uniform rules across the EU. Its objective is to increase crowdfunding services while ensuring transparency and user protection. Access to finance is particularly challenged for young social entrepreneurs. Lenders and investors often struggle with assessing the level of risk of youth and social entrepreneurship projects. So within DG Employment, we try to improve the situation. We offer comprehensive financial and non-financial support for social entrepreneurs and notably young social entrepreneurs, as well as to their financiers, by reducing their transaction costs when providing business development support services. Through the social investment and skills window of the InvestEU program, we launched products supporting financial intermediaries who are financing or investing in social enterprises. And our main implementing partner in that respect is the European Investment Fund. National authorities can also do a lot, and they can design access to finance aid schemes in compliance with state aid rules. Last week, we proposed a Council recommendation on developing social economy framework conditions. This will be a Council recommendation, so for the moment it's just a proposal from the Commission. And in this proposal, there is a chapter on access to public and private funding. And we hope that this will be quickly discussed and agreed by the Member States in the Council. I stop here. I think it's enough for introduction. I trust you will have interesting debate, and also today you will have also practical exercises, the hackathon. So there you need to be with energy and inspiration. We will have other occasions to meet and to discuss, as access to finance is only one of the barriers. Among the others, there's the lack of entrepreneurial skills, which is another subject which will be dealt with in the framework of this academy. So without further ado, let me give the floor to my colleague from the OECD, David Harabinsky.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see all of you again. We had a good time in Brussels at the launch event, and I'm happy to reconnect with all of you today. Now, of course, we're a smaller group. You know that we've divided into 3 groups. So this will be the first workshop where we work together as a group, and we'll have one more in October, and then we're going to mix up the groups. So take advantage of today to get to know your colleagues and counterparts from other countries in the group, and carry that on to next year, and then you'll have a chance to meet others from other countries. So today we're going to be talking about access to finance. It, of course, is a vast topic with lots of different issues we could pick up. So what we're going to do is try to scratch the surface in a broad sense, and then we're going to hear Italy about what's happening in Italy, and we'll probably talk about microfinance and some non-financial services, and then we will get into crowdfunding, which was signaled as one of the particular areas of interest by this group. Now, we're all very excited about the YEPA. We think this is a really important initiative. And there has always been a strong interest in public policy with regards to supporting young people. Now, if you look back, decades, if you go back decades, you can see that young people have always had challenges in the labor market. The unemployment rate by young people has always been about double that of the overall rate. And as you know, the past decade, we've had a series of shocks and crises, and young people have been hit the hardest among these shocks. We saw that in 2008-9, we had the financial crisis where unemployment rates shot up dramatically for young people, well over 50% in many regions in the EU, and that lingered on for many years. We saw it again in COVID-19, and there the impacts were even broader. Education was interrupted, so that had a greater impact on the lives of young people. The good news is that the lingering effects seem to have dissipated much quicker than they have when we had the financial crisis a decade ago. But we know that nonetheless, these negative shocks can have lasting impacts for young people. Those who experience unemployment spells in their youth are much more likely to be unemployed later on in their career. And they're also more likely to have children that face difficulties in the labor market. So there is some evidence to suggest that some of these effects are intergenerational. But now that even we're getting over the COVID challenge, there are other challenges that young people face. Cost of living is increasing very quickly. We haven't seen inflation rates like this in decades. There are housing difficulties, and all of these challenges hit young people the hardest. So the OECD and the EU have both responded with various packages of policies. At the OECD, we had a recommendation last year that the ministers of all OECD countries signed on to that aim to help young people in employment and work, as well as education and other elements of their life. And we are doing our part at the Center for Entrepreneurship by trying to support governments with information and support on strengthening the policies and programs to help young entrepreneurs. So YEPA is an important part of that. And so we count on you to share your experience and your knowledge, and we can help disseminate that, of course, within the YEPA, but also beyond. And just 2 quick points before I pass the floor on. First of all, that this is part of a broader collaboration with the EU. The OECD has been working with DG Employment for more than a decade on inclusive entrepreneurship, we call it. And that is about policies and programs that seek to address issues around inclusion, diversity, social inclusion, labor market inclusion of different population groups. You know, the main question is, to what extent can entrepreneurship help achieve some of these other policy objectives? So over the last 10 years, we've produced a lot of materials, including the Missing Entrepreneurs reports that you might already know about. That's the flagship report with a lot of statistics and different policy chapters and discussion and advice for governments. The next edition will be published in November of this year, so that will be the Missing Entrepreneurs 2023. Another important tool to flag is called the Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool. We developed this for policy stakeholders to be able to work together and to give them a frame to think about the policy environment in their local context and to have an informed dialogue with others, with the objective, of course, of trying to identify strengths and weaknesses and trying to then take steps to address those gaps and weaknesses. Now, I'll finish today by saying that once again, this is quite an important topic, and we have seen it going up the political agenda. And next week in Paris, we are hosting a ministerial meeting for ministers who are responsible for SME and entrepreneurship policy. So there'll be ministers coming from more than 40 countries, and over the 2-day meetings, this issue is one of the top topics that will be discussed. There will be dedicated sessions towards diversity and inclusion in entrepreneurship. So we've been working on this for many years, and we're making a difference. We've got political attention. And so I invite you to help us with that dialogue with ministers by sharing your knowledge, by raising questions, and we can feed your information back to the ministers, even next week, and of course, beyond. So I will stop here. And once again, I'll say it's nice to see everybody again. And you might recall that each of these workshops has a host. And so our host for today is Flavia, and she's from Italy. And so I'll just pass the microphone to her, and she can do a brief introduction to introduce herself, and perhaps a few words on the significance of the topic. Flavia, over to you.
Hello, thank you, David. Good afternoon, all. So as a communication specialist for the National Microfinance Agency here in Italy, I've been working on the projects, on 2 national projects that are Yes, I Startup and Self-Employment, that are both aimed at supporting self-employment and self-entrepreneurship. So working on the project, of course, me and my team were able to identify what were the most common challenges faced by young entrepreneurs. And we could note that the major obstacle was, first of all, the lack of knowledge of what it actually takes to be an entrepreneur. So what are the entrepreneurial skills that are necessary to start such a path? And the lack of familiarity with the tax and social security system. So these were the main obstacles, and also the big bureaucracy problem that we have here in Italy that really slows down any kind of initiative was also a main issue, because it's very complicated for young people to navigate the dense network of regulations. Other than that, also the size of the market has changed. So young people find themselves to operate in a market that is not local anymore, but is globalized. And so the dynamics change and have changed lots. And so skills that are necessary for them to approach a path like this. The Yes, I Startup project tried to respond to all of this by creating courses, training courses, aimed at filling these gaps. Also, forgot to mention the digitalization. So the digital gap also was an issue. All these, of course, create some other issues in what we're talking about today. So access to finance. The two projects were thought to be implemented together, right? Because a good business plan that is capable of responding to the requirements of funding measures is very important to have. So both the measures are, I mean, they are separate measures, but it's very advisable for the participants to follow them both, because of course a good training and tutoring can guarantee a successful funding. So I will present these two measures and more in detail, along with the obstacles that we identified later on in the workshop. So I'll leave the word to you again, and I'll see you later.
Great, thank you, Flavia. Now, before we go any further, I just want to pause for a few seconds just to give you an overview about how today is going to work. You should have each received an agenda and a short note that gives you a bit of an overview of the different issues that we're going to be covering. So on the agenda, we're going to follow it as it is. There were no changes. We're going to do a quick little warm-up with Helen, and that will be followed by a short presentation of the background note, just in case you didn't have a chance to look at it. I will give you a bit of an orientation for the rest of the session. Then we'll come back to Flavia, who will do a presentation of her work and the two programs that she noted in her intro. Study that will be presented by Francesca, and that will be about crowdfunding. We'll then pause and we'll have some discussion. There's lots of time for Q&A. We'll take a break in about an hour. We'll take a 15-minute break so you can get up and stretch. And then we'll get into the little policy hackathon, which will be a chance for you to discuss a bit more freely with your counterparts and colleagues here today. And we'll explain that once we get to the second half of the session. So I encourage you to be active. You can raise your hand, take the floor. You can insert feedback, questions, comments into the chat. And let's go. So I'll pass it over to Helen, who will get us thinking a little bit.
Thank you, David. Yes, we're going to jump right into an interactive session. You should be able to see my screen, and I've put in the chat the link and code to a Mentimeter quiz. So the idea is to get some flash feedback from you all on what you're expecting for today's workshop, where you're coming from, and what you're hoping to achieve. So if you can just scan the code or go to menti.com and enter the code 18691587. We will get started. I'm going to advance the slide, but you should still be able to see the QR code and the link and code if you're doing this on your computer. We'll wait for most of you to get connected before I start. Let's see, looks like we're about halfway there. Give you all a few more seconds to connect, and then we'll begin. Okay, looks like most of us are there. So the first question asks you to rank what you are most familiar with in terms of access to finance. So you can choose between microfinance, fintech, procurement, innovation grants, tax incentives or relief, and financial literacy. So we're curious on where everyone's coming from today and see what the top two seem to be. It looks like microfinance has taken the lead so far. As more responses come in, we'll see how it shifts. Fintech and innovation grants, tax relief. There we go. Financial literacy is moving up the ranks. I'll give you all a few more seconds to respond before moving to the next question. Okay. Looks like spoke too soon. Microfinance is the #1 topic. So we'll get into that a little bit more later on. The next question is, what would you like to know more about in terms of access to finance for young entrepreneurs? What are you curious to learn from the others in the YEPA network and from our speakers today? This is an open-ended question, so feel free to put in whatever you are interested in. Waiting for the results to come in. There we go. Helping less educated young people. What role can the private sector play? So bridging between the private and public sectors with strategic partnerships, different types of national policies and tools that can be deployed, international good practices, how to tailor and target different groups. Outreach is an important issue, especially for underrepresented and disadvantaged groups. These are great questions. Crowdfunding platforms. You're in luck. We have a great speaker today that will go into crowdfunding platforms and how they can be successfully implemented. Microfinance, great. We will do our best to answer these questions through the presentations as well as the discussion. As David mentioned, if it wasn't picked up in today's session, you will have access to the other sessions of Group A and B where they might have been picked up in more detail. And the last slide is just a reminder that the chat in the Zoom is open. So throughout today's event, please feel free to put in your comments, questions throughout the sessions. We will be taking note and happy to answer your questions. I'll pass the floor back to David. I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, there we go. I was on mute. Sorry about that. It was good to see those responses. It helps give us a little bit of a guide for how we go through the presentations. I'll start today by giving you a quick overview of the note that was already shared with you, just in case you haven't had a chance to look at it. So you should see the slides. Helen, nod if that's true. Yeah, okay, great. So what I wanted to do was start with a pretty fundamental question of who are young entrepreneurs? And this came up in I think it came up in each of the kickoff workshops that we had a few weeks ago with the different groups. There were questions about what exactly are we talking about? Who are young entrepreneurs? And so I was thinking about this, and as I was trying to think of how to answer this, it occurred to me that there are actually two different answers with two different perspectives. So we'll start with the policy perspective. If you look at a lot of the EU policy, that tends to use the age grouping of 15 to 29 years old. So the broad EU policy measures like the Youth Guarantee, the Youth Employment Initiative, use that as what the definition of youth is. Now at the program level, so when governments are implementing initiatives, that definition can vary. If you look at some of the southern EU member states like Spain, there you have very high unemployment rates among young people. And so often what happens is the programs, especially the entrepreneurship programs, will extend the upper age range to 40 or 45 years old. So there you've got perhaps some beginning of middle age people captured by that definition of youth. And you also see that in some of the OECD countries outside of the EU. You might remember we had Karen from Canada at the event in Brussels, and her organization uses a different definition going up to 35 years old. So there is a bit of definition differences in the different programs. You could also take the perspective of statistics. You know, a lot of the statistical analysis has traditionally used 15 to 24. For example, the labor force survey has always used that as the youth definition. But that's changed recently. Eurostat has just launched a youth portal where they gather statistics on all aspects of social and work life, and they have used the age grouping of 15 to 29 in that portal. So if you're ever in the need for statistics, I would encourage you to look that up, the youth portal on the Eurostat website. They've got a lot of data there, all using the same definition of 15 to 29. Now, just a quick note, in some of the work that we do as part of this collaboration with the EU, for example, the missing entrepreneurs, we've decided to start 20 years old, so 20 to 29 years old. And the reason we've made that decision is that we have placed a focus on employment policy, entrepreneurship policy, and by doing so, we are putting less of an emphasis on education policy. And so we are making the assumption that young people 15, 16, 17 years old are not really in the labor market. They're still in formal education. So for that reason, we have used a slightly different definition. Now, I want to paint a quick picture for you. I mean, Ruth has already given you some indications of this, but I want to show you who young entrepreneurs are and how diverse they are as a group, both in terms of the types of activities, but also across countries. Now, the data I'm going to show you, I'll just flash through it quite quickly, but it comes from the new Eurobarometer survey. It's number 513 if you want to look it up. It's called Social Entrepreneurship and Youth, Eurobarometer number 513. So one of the questions it asks is, do you want to be an entrepreneur or self-employed, or would you prefer to be an employee? And if you look at the EU average, it's about 40% of young people, so that's under 30, say they would prefer to be self-employed rather than an employee, and then about 60% or almost 60% say they would prefer to be an employee. So that's what that's showing, but you see there's a huge variation across countries, ranging from about 20% in Spain who say they want to be self-employed, all the way up to more than half in the countries on the right-hand side, Greece, Croatia, Portugal, Lithuania, and Cyprus. Now, the reason for this variation, of course, is due to many factors. One is cultural. How is entrepreneurship viewed in society? Is it something that's appreciated or not? How do people view risk? Is it something that you would be able to manage, or is it something you avoid? Of course, labor market conditions are also an important factor. Are there strong labor markets with lots of employment opportunities or not? Or do people have to fend for themselves to create their own job? There's also a question about why would you prefer to be self-employed? And I've put the top 3 answers here. The number 1 is an issue of independence. They want to have control over what they do. They want to be their own boss. Similarly, there was an option, freedom to choose how you organize your work. When do you work? What time? Where do you work? Against the issue of freedom. Bringing an idea to life, so controlling your idea and making it happen, was the number 3rd answer. And there's a whole list of about 10 factors. So that's a quick glimpse of how that varies across the countries. But the sense of independence and freedom really comes out in the responses. Skip over that. Let's come to finance. So finance came up very strongly in the survey in 2 respects. First of all, where do you get your money? And there were some questions around that. And as Ruth said, founders, family, and friends are typically the top answers. We see that here. Banks were number 2. That was a little bit unexpected, but it is another possibility for entrepreneurs, but it's not necessarily bank loans. Entrepreneurs often use personal lines of credit, credit cards, and other personal vehicles of accessing finance for their business. So that might explain that, or it might just be that young people are aware of banks, and so that's one of the first things that comes into their mind. Public institutions are down in about the middle, not so frequently cited. Crowdfunding about the same level. And then some of the other possibilities, business incubators, venture capital, some of the ones you hear about have a lot of buzz, are not used by very many people. There's a quick glimpse across the countries. Savings was the most popular in most countries, but the proportion who replied that varies quite substantially. Finance was also identified as one of the main areas of support needed. So there was a question, if you were to start a business, what type of support would you need? Finance was number one, but the thing that's interesting to me is that it's grants specified, presumably grants with no conditions, but in practice, grants often have conditions. And if you go all the way down to the right, you see loans and microfinance were down at the right-hand side. And of course, some of the other issues that have already been mentioned, skills, networking, also very often desired by young entrepreneurs. And so one of the things we want to think about today is the relationship between the different types of interventions. A little advertisement, this will be one of the chapters in the next Missing Entrepreneurs report. We basically do a meta-analysis of program evaluations to come up with some main messages. And I think some of the preliminary ones I would share are, first of all, financial supports can have a positive impact, but it seems like there is a short duration for that positive effect of about 2 or 3 years in many cases, and then the support has dissipated, and so it's finite. Skills, of course, is another one, and there are some evaluations that show that when you combine finance and non-financial support, you can have a greater impact. Although interestingly enough, that's not a universal finding. On their own, skill supports tend to have broader positive effects in terms of employability and so on. So there's some further questions that we have to explore around the interaction between the different types of support. So the reason for these gaps in access to finance, well, we've already noted some of these. There are skills gaps, so young people are less experienced in work, they're less familiar with their options, they have smaller networks that they can use to access finance, and they have little savings and collateral that can be used to secure debt. There are also barriers on the supply side, so that is speaking about the lenders and the investors. It's often difficult to assess the risk that young entrepreneurs have because they don't have much of a track record. So it's hard to make, let's say, assumptions about future behavior because there's not much of a track record of past behavior to go off of. Transaction costs can be high when dealing with young entrepreneurs, particularly if they're seeking very small amounts of money. So these refer to the fixed costs of basically opening an application and doing verification. And those fixed costs are, of course, a higher proportion of smaller amounts of investments and loans. So it becomes much more expensive for the lender or investor to undertake that activity, which of course is a disincentive. And there are some young entrepreneurs that might face investor bias. There's some experimental research, quite a lot in the US, that highlights gender bias. And there are also some studies suggesting that immigrants would face bias as well. So that's another possible factor that some people might face. And then the final point is that there are some surveys that suggest that social entrepreneurship is very popular among young people, and they face additional challenges. And one of the big challenges that they face is that they're operating a new type of activity. It's not necessarily a traditional business model. And so that causes difficulties for the lenders and investors in terms of the assessment. But there's also an issue in terms of whether the financial instruments are suitable for that type of activity. And there's a body of research that my colleagues have produced, my colleagues in the social entrepreneurship team at the OECD, that suggests that basically these new types of business models are not very well matched with the traditional financial instruments, which means that they often are not given access to them. So there's a lot of material, as I noted at the very beginning. If you ever want to dig into any of these much deeper, that I put a little reference list in the background note. And government is, of course, trying to address a lot of those barriers. There's a suite of financial instruments that I put on the left. I've probably overlooked a few, but these are the most common ones: grants, soft loans, loan guarantees, microfinance, alternative debt instruments, crowdfunding, business angels. Governments are sometimes active in creating angel networks and providing capital to angel investors. Self-financing groups are not so common, mostly in migrant communities. And risk capital is a growing area for government where they're actually making equity investments in entrepreneurs. And there are many examples in Ireland. There's several equity programs at Enterprise Ireland. In Poland, there are pre-seed financing initiatives where there's a small equity stake taken by public actors. And in many cases, these types of financial instruments are used in combination with non-financial supports. That would be training and coaching in most cases. And we see an increased use of online platforms to facilitate these types of training. And the other note is that these packages are often integrated, but not always. Sometimes they're sequenced. So for example, you might have a grant that requires the recipient to take a training program before they can access the grant. So that would be an example of where the support is sequenced. So I'll stop there and we'll dig deeper into some of these issues with the additional presentations and case studies by Francesca and Flavia, but we'll pause to see if there are any burning questions from anybody. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. There are no takers, it seems, so we will go to Flavia. So we'll invite Flavia to make a presentation on the initiatives that she's involved in, and she'll perhaps speak a little bit more broadly on some of the issues that we flagged in this introduction.
Okay.
So Flavia, over to you.
I'll share the screen. Let me see if you see it. Can you all see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, YEPA startup and self-employment are both measures aimed at supporting self-employment and self-entrepreneurship among young people. So let's start with YEPA startup. YEPA startup is the business management, education and training project that is managed by the Italian Agency for Microfinance. And includes both theoretical training and tutoring. Tutoring happens in the pre-startup phase and in the post-startup phase. So it was launched in 2018, offering free courses designed to convey all the skills that are necessary to create an effective business plan that is consistent with one's business idea, and to prepare all the required documentation to request a loan and start their own business. So the courses are aimed at needs, as we know, so not in employment, education and training that have an idea to develop. So the courses are organized in classrooms of at least 4 students and a maximum of 12. And they last a total of 80 hours. So 60 hours are for theoretical training, so held in the classroom, and 20 are for personalized tutoring. During the personalized tutoring, the student can work with their tutor to actually build their own business plan. So the project, as I mentioned before, is aimed at accessing the self-employment measure that finances projects ranging from 5 to 50,000 euros with 0 interest loans and without the need for collateral. This is another issue that we could identify working for the project. So the lack of guarantees of many young people that make it difficult for them to access traditional loans. The strength of the measure is the management model. So we have a public-private partnership network that is made of different subjects that are specialized in training. These subjects can be universities, associations, professional offices, chambers of commerce, whoever has experience in training. The recruitment and involvement of the target in the training courses is carried out throughout the country by these bodies. They are very essential for the identification of the category of subjects on the territory. So we didn't create new subjects to do this, but we used what was already on the territory and the subjects who already had a channel of communications to their local reality. During the COVID, of course, there was the need to keep the project going. So we weren't able to have classrooms anymore. And so these new conditions led to a unique remote training program, thanks to which the students were able to keep on learning. And at the same time, the subjects providing the training were able to carry out their mission without the costs related to the sanitation of environment or the purchase of safety devices and so on. The project is based on 3 pillars. These 3 pillars came as solutions to the problems that we could notice in the first months of the project. So the careful selection of the training structure. In order to become part of this partnership network, every subject must have experience and skills in the field of training, suitable and equipped classrooms, even if now the project is totally in online mode, and qualified teachers. Of course, for the teachers, there are another number of requirements that they have to align with. Standardization and uniformity of training. So what we noticed is that being this a national project, we had to guarantee the same quality of service, the same quality of training, regardless of the geographical area. So to ensure this, the teachers are first trained throughout the national territory through webinars and meetings, and then equipped with modules and slides to follow for each day of class. A monitoring platform was developed to allow the evaluation of the output. So the platform highlights the performance of the training bodies and allows the managing authority to intervene in critical situations in order to maintain a high level of qualitative supply. These are some numbers of the first edition. So 1,700 NEETs were trained, 500 structures were activated to work along with the project, 1,500 classrooms, 1,600 teachers were employed in the project as well, 350 completed courses, 100 of which in the online distant learning mode. A very important number for us is the percentage of survival of businesses that were funded through self-employment, which is over 97%. So following the results achieved, Yes Startup was recognized as an Italian good practice to help vulnerable groups to create new businesses. The network model allows to quickly involve the territory, and this is why the second edition of Yes Startup was extended to 2 new target groups, women and long-term unemployed. And the measure has been already replicated at a regional level in Calabria, Tuscany, and Sicily, with regional funds, of course. So again, what we were able to see through these 2 projects is that training and tutoring are 2 essential requirements for building a business plan that is also capable of responding to the requirements of the financing system. So another important factor that we try to address with the projects is the importance of support in the phase following the opening of the business. Sometimes there's too much emphasis placed on the pre-startup support, but then when the students move from theory to practice, then is where real obstacles come up. And so this phase is particularly delicate. And the development of YESA startup in the new edition provides for intensified support. Talking about funds, of course, these dedicated and tailored funds are very important, but sometimes the limitations can make it difficult for young entrepreneurs to access. We have many funds that are dedicated to the south, a little less to the north. Many funds dedicated to needs. So maybe there are other groups like young people that are working to pay their studies and so on that cannot access this type of funds. So there are many limitations based on geographical location, specific entrepreneur profile, or sector of operation. And the operation to be implemented is to create funds that are not only dedicated to a wider audience with more flexible requirements, but also that do not have strict deadlines. We have had cases of funds that are maybe active for a couple of years, but then students or young people don't even have the time to understand how to access them, to develop a business plan, and they are already close to the end. So these are policy proposals that I think would benefit the situation here for sure, and in Europe, in all European countries in general. So now the YESA Startup project and the self-employment request to request funding, the whole thing is done online. So this was a good evolvement of the project, because students don't have to wait anymore for a course to start in their own city, but they can sign whenever they want on the online mode. So I am done with the presentation and open to any question.
Great, thank you very much, Flavia. You hit on a number of points, and some of them are issues that are dear to my heart. I really like the monitoring approach, is one of my favorite elements among the issues you talked about. But I think what we'll do is we'll go to the next presentation with Francesca, and then we'll take questions and discussions both together, so everyone can think about questions for Flavia. I've already got some, if there are none, but we'll pick those up after. So it's with great pleasure to introduce the second presenter today, who is Francesca from the European Crowdfunding Network. She's going to tell us all about crowdfunding, how it works, and how it's used in practice. So Francesca, over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you everyone for the invitation. Thank you, Flavia, as well, for giving me an insight into my own country, because I wasn't quite aware of how the functioning mechanisms were. Really happy to be here. Just one small question before I start is, how are we doing on time? You let me know. I mean, still 20 minutes?
Yeah, that's great.
All right, wonderful. So let's start right away so I can introduce you to the topic of crowdfunding. I don't know if I will be able to tell you all about it. I guess not, but I will try to do my best to give you an overview, and then of course there will be time for further questions. As you see, and as David was saying, I work for the European Crowdfunding Network. I am deputy director. I've been involved in the crowdfunding ecosystem since 2016. So if you keep in mind that the market first developed in Europe in 2013, that's quite a long time, and I'm lucky enough to have seen the market grow and develop along the years. So the way that I wanted to structure this short presentation today is, let's reverse the usual structure. So let's not have me tell you the theory about crowdfunding. Let's start from what are the most common questions and criticisms that I have heard across years on crowdfunding, and I will try to give you well, some insight and also some answers to those criticisms. So this is more or less what we're going to tackle. Mainly most common misconceptions that are around crowdfunding, and then we'll go on to examples and some case studies, and then of course we can move further into the detail. Just for your reference, the European crowdfunding network is a network that moves at the European level. Of course, we're based in Brussels. We were set up in 2013. We're now active in a number of different countries. I'm based in Italy. We have offices in Germany, in Spain. We're trying to decentralize in line with the nature of crowdfunding. And our mission is, of course, to promote the knowledge, the good use of crowdfunding to all those parties that could benefit from the mechanism. And the parties that could benefit from the mechanisms are, of course, in the first place, those that seek to raise the finance. So companies, NGOs, individuals, but also those that look at a way to diversify or support economically specific initiatives. And this is why I'm here, public authorities as well, at all levels, because there is a way that the mechanism can interact with policy, with public funds, and we're going to see that in a second. What we do as a, your usual EU-based network, we work on policy. We try to advise as much as we can, because we know that there is a lack of advisory in terms of how to better approach crowdfunding, and then we try to educate. So that lack of knowledge, the training session that Flavia was also mentioning, for us on crowdfunding, they're even more important, because if there is a general lack of knowledge about how to access funding, how to structure a good business model, how to set up my startup, there is even a lack of knowledge about the option that you can use, that is crowdfunding. So we have to do this double work. And then, of course, we have a whole activity on conduct, ethics. We want the industry to be professional, and we want everyone to approach crowdfunding having a counterpart that is reliable. So this is the fourth, but probably most important pillar of our activity. Let's go to the misconception. That was enough about Eurocrowd. The most common thing I hear when I start or when I am introduced to anyone, mostly, is that crowdfunding is basically the same thing as online charity, donations, and that it can be effective for very specific causes or initiatives, mainly not for profit, but it's really not a resource for those companies that want to engage in significant growth and development. Okay, this is the first and most misleading misconception, because in crowdfunding, it is true that you have that part of donation, but as you see in this slide, we have 4 different types of crowdfunding that we call models, 4 models of crowdfunding. 2 of these models, the donation and the reward crowdfunding models, are non-financial crowdfunding. It means they allow you to raise the funding, but there is no financial implication in the type of funding that you raise. So they're more or less similar to a subsidy, a grant. In the donation model, there is basically nothing that the project owner, so the person that looks to raise the funding, has to give back to the people that provide the funding, because it's mainly used for charity. So the misconception is not entirely false. It's just not valid for every model of crowdfunding, because, for example, the reward model is often used by companies, by startups, to do a pre-sales of their product, to increase their visibility, to extend their clients or potential client base. If you've heard of Kickstarter in America, that is exactly the specific model that they use, reward in a pre-sales model. Then we have the 2 financial crowdfunding models, which are equity and lending, and they follow exactly the scheme of the financial instruments that they replicate. That means in the lending model, we have the classic loan type of interaction. Instead of having one counterpart that is, for example, a banking institution for giving you a loan or giving the company a loan, we have a number of small lenders, retail lenders, that can be anyone, individuals, that decide to provide part of the loan through a crowdfunding platform in order to allow the company to reach the total loan that they need and therefore have the liquidity. So the scheme is the same as a loan that goes through the traditional banking system, except there is no banking intermediary. It's specific individuals that decide to give the loan or parts of the loan. And then we have the equity model. And the equity model was also mentioned by David. It works a little bit like the business angels and the venture capital funds. You have a startup looking to raise risk capital in exchange for part of the ownership. So they're willing to give out shares, so ownership in the company. And they do so through an equity crowdfunding platform. So again, they try to reach as many small investors as they can to get to the same end result, really. So to raise the risk finance that they need to carry on their development. So as you see already from now, the crowdfunding system, ecosystem is very diverse. It's very flexible. It can be adapted and adopted by different players for different needs. The same amount of money could be raised through equity lending or reward according to different objectives of the company. And the fact that is so disintermediated allows also the different target groups than the usual suspect to access this mechanism and in turn access finance. Just for you to have a clear picture of what I'm talking about in terms of significance of the instrument. Since 2013 until 2020, we have seen that the market, the European crowdfunding market in terms of volumes has been growing consistently and also at quite a high rate. We expect this growth to continue because there will be a new regulation, a European regulatory framework. Ruth was mentioning this in her introduction, in her opening, and this will make operation more standardized on one end, but also easier cross-border within the EU. But we will look at that in a second. So just the first takeaway that you have to, I would like you to bring home after this session for this first misconception is crowdfunding is diverse. And crowdfunding has proven to be reliable, because if you think of how the mechanism is structured, there could be no growth in a crowdfunding market there is no trust and success track record in past performances, because growing, it means that there are more companies asking for funds, but also that there are more investors or individuals willing to give the funds that the companies need. So the two parties are happy with the mechanism, and this leads to the growth. Misconception number 2, crowdfunding is only for the unbankables. I cannot use crowdfunding to raise funds for my company because it looks like I have no other choice and I am desperate. If we can all agree that the term unbankable, banks are useful, banks are there. They're one of the most ancient institutions that we have in the world. They've been there since the Middle Ages successfully. But if we can all agree that the term already contains a bias, because you're identifying a target group as unbankable, which means it's not suited for the banks, we can also agree the fact that we need to provide an alternative to funding that comes through the banks, because there might be target groups that are not suitable for that type of funding or those requirements, and still they have valid ideas that need to access capital through different mechanisms. So just to give you a concrete example, what we have done and closed very recently is one Erasmus-funded project. It's called InCrowd. The thing that we have piloted through InCrowd is more or less resembles what Flavia was mentioning about Yes Startup. We wanted to empower the NEET group, so between 18 and 30 years old, to get access and to unlock their entrepreneurial ideas through crowdfunding. So what we have done is basically we have developed a training program that we have then piloted in 4 different countries. And these are the results. We had 25 campaigns that were launched and 4 will be launched in the coming weeks. The average funding goal was a little over 5,000 euro per campaign, and the average amount raised was over that. So all of the campaigns were basically in overfunding. So they raised more than they requested. And we had an 80% success rate for the campaigns that were published. So this means that this mechanism is being piloted, has been tested, has been proven successful, and this was just the first pilot. We wanted to demonstrate and to actually see if this would work. So of course, this is a different target group. No, I don't think that there is a bank that would be able to give out a loan for 5,000 euro unless, you know, there would be a high transaction cost attached to it. But the people and the entrepreneurs that were supported through this mechanism, they have gathered funding, the funding that they needed, and it was through reward crowdfunding. So basically they have no interest attached to it, and it's just startup capital, small to begin and then to potentially go even further. So it's a start. Third misconception, crowdfunding, it's a patch, it's not a solution. So you can do it once, you can do it twice, you can get lucky and be successful both times, but you cannot build a long-term strategy on it. And so for this, I have to say, I just brought you a case study, a picture of Fairphone. It's a Dutch-based company. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see their equity crowdfunding round. It's been run in 2018. But on the right-hand side, you see the whole funding history of this company. So they started in 2012. And you see that they have run a product placement crowdfunding campaign in 2015. Then they went on to a Series A round, a venture capital round, then again an equity crowdfunding campaign. Then they went back to a venture capital round, and then they moved on across the spectrum of available financing opportunities for their company. The good thing of crowdfunding is that it doesn't just give the people that raise the funding the money. It gives them validation. It gives them something concrete to say, my business model works, my product is attractive, I have a client base, I have people that have pre-purchased this, I have enough liquidity and enough investors among my shareholders that I can actually operate, work, and grow. And this provides reassurance and trust to any equity fund or VC investor or business angel. The other thing is that crowdfunding offers indeed a number of connected opportunities. I was saying it doesn't end with the raising of the funding, but it allows to create new financial schemes, validate new business models, increase the visibility of the businesses, the projects. It allows the people that want to raise the funding to be creative, which is something that in other funding or financing mechanisms you do not have. You have a form, you have strict structures, and you need to fit those structures, otherwise it just won't go. When we look at other opportunities, we also need to look at what can it do for the people that are not, as I said, are not bankable, are not in the mainstream target groups, or are not the next unicorn, because they still have businesses that can run successfully. So the mechanisms allows to raise finance for companies that are maybe in underserved markets, and underserved markets can be very diverse. They go from high-risk sectors, more difficult access to finance because the risk connected to it is higher. So the risk of failure and losing the capital is higher, but it also extends to, you know, the cultural and creative industries. That is traditionally a difficult area, or entrepreneurship in rural areas. These are additional specific sectors if we want to move just to the broader spectrum, in addition to young entrepreneurs. And then the other thing that crowdfunding can do is empower the people that decide to give the funding, because it places a lot of relevance on both social and environmental initiatives, which are perceived as priorities by citizens and potential investors, but are often not so highly regarded by traditional investors. So here I've put a list of the main characteristics that, you know, you can highlight and have a good positioning power if you run a crowdfunding campaign. So everything that deals with social innovation, social inclusion, circularity, environmental sustainability, impact generating ventures in general, and also female entrepreneurship. We have seen this as a developing line. And then how to use crowdfunding to build a strategy, a long-term strategy. Crowdfunding, as I was saying, it's a matching opportunity, and it can be an opportunity to combine finance in a funding mix. So in the long term, in a pipeline, and it goes from, you know, combination with business angels or venture capital or private equity, but also goes with public funding. And public funding, I have brought you a case study at the end. I will show you how it's being combined, but public authorities can definitely benefit from the economic contribution of crowdfunding, but also from the policy side, because it just brings something entirely different to the table. Number 4, as I was saying, other misconception is it only benefits those that get the funding. So if you need to raise the funds, good for you, but either I am the one raising the funding, or I am the one providing the economic support. And so I'm an investor, or I get a product in return, or it doesn't benefit me at all. Well, this is not entirely true in general, but if we look at how match funding initiatives work, so that is the combination of crowdfunding with a public institution mainly, we see that this is an entirely different story, because the institution still has the role of, you know, identifying the areas that are priorities. They provide part of the funding, but they call projects to run a crowdfunding campaign and raise, for example, 50% of the total budget. If they raise 50% of the total budget that they need through a crowdfunding campaign, then they can get the additional 50% from the public funding. What does this mean? That projects need to interact with the local ecosystem. They need to involve citizens. They need to convince them that they have a good idea that will benefit everyone. And citizens have that power of being included in the decision-making process, or at least in the funding allocation process. And so this is a new story. It's a new paradigm of interaction. And in terms of social impact for citizens, there is more sense of ownership towards those funded initiatives. They're directly involved in, you know, local development decision making. They contribute to what happens around them, and the projects get visibility. For public authorities, this means that with the same budget allocation, if they combine 50-50 with crowdfunding, in the end there will be double the amount of funding available to be provided to projects, because half of it will come from crowdfunding and half will come from the public authority. So either more funding for the same number of projects, or more projects to be potentially financed. And finally, and this is the most important thing, citizens can express their preferences. So I am Italian, and I always hear things like, why did they fund this specific initiative from the municipality X and Y? This is not what we need. There are other priorities. Well, with this type of match funding, you can actually have the opportunity to express among the list of projects that are selected, which one of those are the ones that are closer to your heart, that you think are a priority for your community. So there is a new paradigm of interaction, but there's also more accountability, more transparency in how the funding is allocated. And then the next question is, well, okay, but it's really hard to do it. It's really hard as a public authority to combine my policies with crowdfunding, because admin and reporting procedures are so complex. We have developed a full report, so I'm not going to go into detail. I'm just going to touch upon the fact that there are at least 5 different roles that we have collected across Europe, in which public authorities have played different roles when engaging with crowdfunding. It goes from a very light role in which the public authority is just providing the service to kind of encourage the use of crowdfunding, so capacity building, awareness raising, training, up until the role, which is the facilitator role, in which there is this clear match funding that I was just telling you about, which is also quite intense in terms of admin setup. So there is a whole spectrum between these two roles, and there is so many opportunities for public authorities to engage in crowdfunding, especially if we think of the new regulation. This means, as we were saying, the regulation is going to standardize, harmonize rules. It's going to be entering into force on the 10th of November this year. For public authorities, it means that it will be much easier to replicate best practices that you see happening in another member state, bring it back to your own country, because there will be no legal fragmentation among countries as we had until, well, still now going on until the regulation is over. In addition to this, national authorities will be also able to combine some tax incentives to these match funding schemes, and they will be able to further promote crowdfunding and match funding as a risk dilution mechanism, because they will not have to assume the risk of funding a company, a startup, a venture on their own, but they will share this with potentially a crowd of investors. I think it's the last misconception, or one of the last ones, is how, as a public authority, I'm convinced, okay, I want to do this, but how am I going to convince citizens that are already taxpayers that they need to further give money to finance initiatives in my territory? This has a bad repercussion on my reputation and my image as public authority. So this is a process, of course. You're inviting the citizens to contribute financially, and it's an invitation, it's not an obligation, contrary to taxes, which are, of course, necessary. And the invitation is to kind of launch a new process for interaction, for participation, for transparency. So it is true that you're asking them to financially contribute to some initiatives, but it's to reinforce the fact that they want to see it happening. And on the other hand, the counter effect of you asking citizens to financially contribute is you're letting go of part of the decision-making process that has always been firmly in your hands as a public authority on specific subjects. So it's a give and take. It's a process. It needs to find a balance. It needs iteration, but education and information of citizens are key. And the first thing before you can educate and train citizens and inform them is to really fully understand how the mechanisms work and train the civil servants that are going to be working on it and interacting with the citizens. Also, I was right. It was the last basically misconception. I just brought you 2 case studies, but we have a full report with 26 best practices, a blueprint on how to set up the match funding scheme. And there's us also very happy to support you. You can download the report here and check, whether in your country something is happening. Just 2 case studies. The first one, Lithuania. Invega is the national agency. They interact with the European Social Fund. So they manage they are the managing authority for the European Social Fund in Lithuania. And they have struck a partnership with FinB, which is a lending crowdfunding platform, so loans. And they have this top-up scheme. So if the company can raise a specific amount of money through the crowdfunding platform, Invega will further contribute and finalize the needed amount for the loan. They started with 4.6 million euro. They increased it to 10 million euro from the public budget to support anti-COVID backlashes for companies. And just recently in March, the director of this program has further committed to an additional increase as soon as the 10 millions are over. So it's a program that will be refinanced for the 3rd year, or not the 3rd year, but the 3rd time. So it's quite successful. And it's been done with a financial instrument, loan-based crowdfunding. We move to Belgium, non-financial crowdfunding. So the crowdfunding model is reward. So it's more or less a pre-sales or subsidy type of fundraising. The public authority was the Flemish public authority for that deals with youth and support to youth entrepreneurship. It was limited to the Brussels region. so the Bruxelles Capital. And the idea is that it's dedicated to youth and youth entrepreneurship. For every donation or contribution that the projects receive, the public authority will provide an extra 40%. So it's not a 50-50, it's a 60-40, but the overall idea is still the same. So let's have young people demonstrate that they really want to bring this to the ground and really want to make it go, and then the public authority will happily contribute and support the development of the venture. This program as well, end of April, was confirmed to be relaunched for next year, and this was also one of the best practices of the in-crowd project that I was mentioning in the opening of my presentation. So there's 24 more. For now, I'm sorry, I know I have exceeded the time. I'm very sorry about that, but these are my contacts and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Another very good presentation. So we've got some time before the break to take questions on either of the two presentations. We're going to open the floor. You can raise your hand. You can enter in the chat and we'll pick up the questions as we go. While everyone is thinking their question, I'll perhaps start with one of my own. And it's for Francesca. And I was wondering if, I don't know how to start the question. Sometimes when you have equity investments, part of the deal is that the investor has some sort of influence over the entrepreneur. Does that ever occur in crowdfunding? Do you ever see that, or is it not really possible with the crowd?
No, it is. This is actually a very good question, because it's one of the points of resistance that entrepreneurs face when they move from crowdfunding to, for example, business angels or VC funds, because they are afraid of the fragmentation of the cap table. So they are afraid that there's too many people with the right to vote in the board of directors, and they don't want to engage with this fragmentation. So crowdfunding has found two solutions. The first one is when you structure the buy-in deal. So when a company is offering its shares, it usually has two different levels of contributions. One that is a very low level, open to everyone, maybe starting at 100 or 200 euro, very small investment, but that doesn't give any voting power to the person that contributes that amount. Then we have, it just gives them the benefit if there is dividends or profits to be redistributed to get their share, or if there is an exit to profit according to the percentage that they hold. If then there is the second level, which is usually much higher, talk about tens of thousands of euro, like 15,000 or 20,000, that level is usually the one that also is connected to voting rights in the assembly of shareholders. So this is the first option. So you only have the shareholders with voting right that are actually investing quite a significant and relevant amount. So they hold a significant number of shares. The second structure is that crowdfunding platform try to facilitate the structuring of a lead investor type of thing. So all the crowdfunding investors, sometimes there are 100, 200, they select, or it's selected for them, one lead investor, which represents the crowdfunding shareholding part at the vote, the general assembly or in the board of directors. So it means that the crowdfunding shareholding group, it votes with one vote, and they have to agree among them. It's still represented, but it reduces the fragmentation on the cap table. So these are two valid options. It depends on the preference of the startup really, and also maybe the type of agreements that they want to further when they try to raise additional funding.
All right, thank you. I see those options. I've got a question for Flavia, and I'll throw it out there now. I see there's a question in the chat, but we'll pick that up in a second. Flavia, can you tell us a bit about the network approach that you've got with the training providers? How do you identify them? How do you monitor their activities? And what happens if it doesn't work out?
So basically, there's a public call, so they can all participate and send their application. This application is followed by an analysis of the requirements. So teachers, equipped classrooms, the spaces, the location, and so on. Once they come to be part of the public-private network, which is made again of different subjects that can be public or private, such as, I don't know, lawyer, law firms, or whoever has something to do with training. Once that happens, they have to reach the number of students, the minimum number of students to start a course. So they're all trained uniformly before the course. Then if they reach the number, they can start the course. The monitoring platform allows the managing authorities. There are some people that have the role of participating in the course and check if they're going smoothly, if they're following the slides, if they're following the schedule, and so on. So if, for example, a course is started with 2 students, and for some reason the other students who signed up don't show up, then that course gets stopped. So it doesn't get reimbursed to the training institution. After that, another level of control is about the output. So the main objective of the course is to have a business plan ready. So all of the students need to present their business plan after the course, and that is considered, a successful output. So these are the criteria based on which the courses are evaluated. Was there? Did I miss something?
No, that was great. That was
Okay.
helpful to get a bit more detail on how it's set up. There's a question in the chat for Francesca. What happens when the projects are not successful? Are the funders able to recover part of their loan or equity?
So we have to make a small distinction here. So there is 2 phases in which the project can fail. One is in the crowdfunding round. So while the campaign is ongoing. So the first case is I have a target of 100,000 euro, and within the time framework of the campaign, I get to 90,000. What happens? Because the campaign is not successful, I'm 10,000 short, but what do I do with all that money? So different models have different options. So in reward and donation crowdfunding, you can opt, if the platform allows, for the keep it all option, which means I still keep the amount of money that I collect, and I implement the activities that I can with that amount of money. The other option is the all or nothing. So that means that if the platform or you choose this second option, if you don't get to 100,000, but only to 99,000, doesn't matter. You still have to give back all the money, and it's an automatic process because the flow of money, it's external to the crowdfunding platforms. So it's managed by an independent payment service provider, which blocks the funds separately from the platform in an online account, and it automatically distributes them. Either the campaign is right, so they go onto the bank account of the project owner, or the campaign is unsuccessful and they go back to where they came from, so to each of the contributors. This is for non-financial crowdfunding. For lending and equity, there is no keep it all option. So either you get what you request or you don't. And in the case that you don't, everything goes back to the investors or the lenders, because that has a financial implication, you know. So you commit to specific conditions, you agree to give out specific shares or to take in specific amount of debt. And at that point, it's either that condition is met or nothing happens. So you have to give back of all the money. And this is the phase one. The phase two is the campaign goes right. So I get all the money for my company, but then the startup fails. What happens then? In that case, there is two different options, mainly focusing on equity and lending, because in reward and donation, it's really difficult that a campaign fails after it gets the funding because of the specificity of the models and the projects. So in lending, since it's a loan and you have a contract, there will be procedures activated usually by the platform, which is the one drafting the contract, for which there will be different tries to recover part of the money or at least the capital, or there will be compromises sought with the owners of the company. So there is a process. For the equity part, it's an equity investment. So if the startup goes bankrupt, it's a risk investment. And the biggest disclaimer that is compulsory by law that you will see in each and every equity crowdfunding platform is your capital is at risk. You will have to take a MiFID questionnaire before you can invest, saying you can lose all the money. Are you aware? And now ESMA also wants every platform to repeat this as an alert to every retail investor that wants to invest above 1,000 euro. So if you want to invest 1,100, you will get a pop-up saying, do you know you can lose everything? Are you aware? And I have to say, from my experience, I invested 100 euro. I didn't go further than that. And I lost all the money. So it does happen. It's a risk investment. It's not guaranteed. So in that case, as an investor, you have to bear the risk of your investment.
All right, thank you for that. This is the last chance before the break for anybody to ask a question. Raise your hand, put it in the chat. I'll hold on for 5 seconds. Otherwise, we're going to go to a break. There's another one from Julian. Has the EU regulation improved the situation then?
Yes, I have to say it has. It has, because we are fully supportive of having a European framework, a reference framework for everyone, for the platforms, for the companies, and for the investors. Because now it's clear. Before, it was very difficult. You know, you would try to set up maybe different schemes, or you would see companies willing to approach investors abroad, but there would be so many legal complications that it was impossible to scale up the business, the market, the industry per se. In this specific case, the regulation has put some clear guidance for everyone, and it's standard for everyone. Is it perfect? No, of course not, but nothing is perfect. You know, it's a start, but it was fundamental to have this first step laid, you know, on paper, black on white, so that the process of being really a professional industry vis-a-vis the companies and the investors alike, and also to any other counterpart, public institution, institutional investors, it was necessary to be clear, to be professional, to kind of have a direction towards which everyone could go. And without the regulation, it would not have been possible. This is going to bring a strong consolidation in the market, which is a nice diplomatic way to say that a lot of crowdfunding platforms will not survive with the new rules because they are quite specific. The requirements are high. It has quite a high cost for them to keep up with all the requirements. But it will ensure that those that survive are reliable, are professional, and have sound business models. So it's a reassurance for everyone. And sometimes it's needed, you know, when a market is maturing, it happens. The consolidation is a natural process.
Okay, Matthew enthusiastically agrees. We'll take the last question before the break. So the question comes from Katya. How can young entrepreneurs identify and protect themselves from potential scams and fraud when using crowdfunding platforms?
They have to really know. They have to really understand what they are dealing with. They have to receive a sort of education in this sense that is unbiased, you know, that tells you this is how things are done properly. And if it's not like this, it's not proper. So for example, if I, let's pretend I am a startup and I approach a crowdfunding platform and they tell me, yes, all of your potential investors will have to take a MiFID license. They will have to register the profiles on the platform, because as a platform, I have to go through the know your customer process. And so know your investor in this case. So I need to keep track of everything. I need to make sure that everything is compliant with the anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism, you know, all the regulations that are attached to it. And so, of course, it becomes a bit of a process to convince all of the potential investors to go through this. So you have to kind of guide them through. It's a lot of investment on behalf of the startup to really make sure that they can secure the funding. And so I start looking for another platform, and something pops up and the other platform tells me, yeah, no worries. They just leave us the email address and then they click on invest, and that's it. This is the registration process that we have. You need to know as a startup that this is illegal, but you need to know. You know, you can look for a platform that has a simpler process. I mean, there are some standard things, so it will be a process anyhow, but there are some things that cannot happen. You know, it's impossible to take down all the steps that are required. There are some cases in which this happens. There are some cases in which projects go online and then they disappear. So they also need to know who is the management behind the platform, what is the track record, are they reliable, are they trustworthy, are they associated to Eurocrowd? No, this is a joke. This is just a joke, but there are some specific criteria. So what you can do to support the startups is really educate them, let them know unbiasedly what needs to be there, what they need to check. It's the same when you go, you know, to the bank and you ask for a loan for your house. I went to the bank recently to buy a house to ask for a mortgage, and you know, I prepared, because they always try to sell you that additional insurance, saying that it's compulsory, that it's, you know, it comes with the mortgage, but it's not. You know, maybe it's not, but you need to tell them, look, it's not. So it's the same. It's the same everywhere.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. Look, we've got 5 minutes left, and so we're going to do a quick wrap up. And I want to start by thanking everyone for their participation today and for putting your ideas out there and asking questions. It was an enjoyable afternoon, so thank you for that. Thank you especially to Francesca and Flavia for the presentations and sharing their work and experience and knowledge with us. We tried to cover quite a lot of ground today. I just want to highlight a few points. You know, if you look at what Flavia was talking about, it's sort of a nice model that involves setting up networks to help deliver services. And that's quite a neat approach. You don't see that very often. And of course, she talked about the way in which they've done it to identify the training providers, to vet them, to provide support, and to monitor what they're doing. It's a really nice way to scale up support, and they've had quite a lot of success, even during COVID, and where they had to move a lot of it online. So a really nice example. Look it up further. We're going to be expanding the note that was shared with you before the workshop. We'll be bringing in more content from the discussion today. So we'll include more information there and further links for where you can look for more information. Francesca did a nice presentation on crowdfunding, which I'm sure we've all heard of, but perhaps had a lot of questions. So she presented some nice models and went through a few examples. And of course, she's got her report with 26 case studies. And hopefully you enjoyed the little exercise where we got to talk through some of the issues around crowdfunding and the different decisions that you have to make and how we might go about doing it. I learned a lot because we had people in my group who have done it before and have made some platforms and helped manage them. So it was nice to hear about their experience and also from some of the people that have participated as entrepreneurs in some of these platforms. So that's it. Workshop number 1 is finished. Thanks again for coming today.